The End of History, a book written by Francis Fukuyama in 1992. What was it? Well, the gist is that with the collapse of the USSR, great power struggles, such as the one between communism and capitalism in the 20th century, were over. The liberal democracy-based world order that the West was modeled after had won out, and barring some ups and downs, most countries would want to achieve that same situation. In short, the great conflicts that defined the 20th century, like World War I, World War II, the Cold War, they were all over. This was the so-called and so heralded end of history. Well, this piece is famous today because obviously he was very wrong. I'm writing this script in 2025, and history has clearly marched on. In my childhood alone, the global war on terror defined the news. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine in what has become the biggest land invasion in Europe since the Second World War. South America is still racked with corruption and cartels. And East Asian countries like Japan and Korea struggle falling birth rates that threaten their entire country. And of course, who could forget the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic that changed the world? I bring this up because as a student of history, I've always felt odd about these historical events, especially World War I and World War II, because in a weird way, I yearn for them. I certainly am not naive enough to want to go back to those times. The chance that I could die in a horrible trench somewhere in the battlefields of Europe are too high. But the small part of me that yearns for those times yearns for them because I recognize that the people of those times had a sense of purpose that is greater than those experienced today. The war, especially World War II, was essentially the biggest good versus evil story in history. No conflict is ever purely black and white, but World War II is about as close as you can get to it. People back then had a greater purpose to strive towards in their life. They had an overarching story that went beyond the model that people who live in my time have, which, for example, include graduating high school, going to college, getting a job, getting married, having kids, and then retiring. Back then, your life was more about just yourself. It was about helping the greater war effort, whether as a soldier or a citizen. Everyone, from children to the elderly, had a part to play. The importance of this sense of purpose is touched on by a book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger. He brings up an interesting story about how during the Blitz, when bombs were falling on London, something curious happened to the patients admitted to the psychiatric wards. Nothing seemed to help these patients until the bombing started. Oddly enough, when nobody had any time to help, those patients themselves got up and started helping out. They started clearing rubble, putting out fires, driving ambulances. It wasn't because they suddenly got better magically. It was because they were needed. This suggests that people need a higher purpose to their lives. For them, the why is all important. When I was a college freshman, I worried that I might be missing this sense of purpose in my own life. I picked up this notion from a book I was reading at the time, where the author lamented that the age of heroes had passed. All the heroic deeds had been done. Columbus had sailed across the Atlantic. The jungles of Borneo had been charted. Even breakthroughs in science felt increasingly out of the reach of ordinary people. What Einstein achieved in his life is very unlikely to be replicated today. Not because people are less capable, but because the field has grown so much. To advance in physics today, you have to dedicate your life to the study and get a PhD. And even then, you'll likely specialize in just one tiny sliver of the subject. And you'll only be able to push the field forward an inch just because of how much knowledge it takes to do. All the great discoveries seemingly have been made. World War I and World War II had been won, and I worried that the great historical struggles were over. I worried that I would never feel the sense of purpose that someone who lived through those times might have felt. And in a way, I still do. Because I know from experience that the only way to feel the highest of highs is to feel the lowest of lows. And that's why the most inspiring stories involve people redeeming themselves from the brink. A drug addict who throws away their stash, showers, loses weight, exercises, eats healthy, gets a stable job, and turns their life around will feel a greater sense of accomplishment than someone who just simply improves their life a little bit. It's the same principle that makes food taste better when you're starving and warmth feel better when you're freezing. Try as I might, I don't think I'll ever experience the same amazement and wonder that someone from an uncontacted tribe might feel if they were to magically walk down a modern grocery store for the first time. Don't get me wrong, I would never trade my place in history for any other, but sometimes I certainly wonder.